This is going to be a tutorial showing a new method of extending which I have come up with, in which you create a grid of cards on top of the puzzle which you are going to be extending, and then filling each one of the little squares with epoxy sculpt. Then you simply remove the grid and you're left with perfect extensions. For this tutorial you will need epoxy sculpt, scissors, some kind of X-Acto knife, a puzzle, and a little bit of sandpaper, fine grit. You first want to start off by cutting your cards into some strips. You want the strips to be roughly 5 millimeters taller than the extensions that you're actually going to be doing. You will need as many as the order of your puzzle. So if you're modding a 10x10 you will need 10 of them, if you're modding a 3x3 you'll need 3 of them. You may have to improvise to make your cards longer or find bigger cards if you're working on anything bigger than a 6x6, as the cards will not be able to extend quite across the puzzle, so you might need to either tape them together or find something else that will work and be big enough for you. If you haven't already, you may want to loosen the tensions, especially if you're working on a higher order puzzle. Now take a full-size card and place it on the far cut on one side of the puzzle. Make sure not to bend your card when you're doing this, and make sure it's also perfectly horizontal. Now take another full-sized card and place it at a 90-degree angle to the other card. Make sure that they're right up against each other, and make sure everything's all nice and horizontal, square. You definitely do not want to bend your cards at this point. Note, the corners in this puzzle have already been extended, but that's not at all necessary. Now take your box cutter and start putting it into the cuts of the puzzle. You will now want to make a slight scratch along the card at every single cut. Make sure not to bend the card at this point, as you will want it to be as straight as possible for later. Note, the scratches don't have to be very deep or very easy to see at this point, just make sure they're there and that they're square. Now we are going to make the cuts a lot easier to see. Put up your master card with the scratches on it against a ruler or some other square object. Then take another card and put it at a 90-degree angle to that. You may want to have a flashlight at a very shallow angle to make the cuts a lot easier to see. Then simply take an X-Acto knife or a razor blade of some kind and use the other card as a guide, and then scratch the surface to make the cuts a lot easier to see. Make sure to keep everything as square as possible and to be as accurate as possible. Now cut along the lines that you just made. Make the cuts about 5 millimeters taller than the little card strips you already made. Now, on each cut, we want to cut off about 0.5 millimeters of material just to make a little notch so we can fit the other cards in comfortably. Make sure to cut this 0.5 millimeters of card off on the same side of each cut, just to keep things consistent. Now that you have completed your master card, you'll then want to place it on top of another card and start tracing out the lines with an X-Acto knife that you had already done. Make sure to trace along the edge that was not used to enlarge the cuts to make a little notch for the other cards, just to keep things as consistent as possible. Then from those scratches you made on the next card, simply repeat the process from that point on that you used to make the master card, and then do as many as you need, about 5 or 6 in my case. Now place the small strips that you made earlier into the puzzle. Of course, making sure everything is as square as possible and there's nothing bent. Now start placing the other cards. You'll notice that more often than not they will not fit perfectly, and you'll need to modify the little cuts so they fit perfectly. You do not want the cards to be bending in any way when you're putting them together. To make the fitting of these cards a lot easier, take an X-Acto knife and put them into the cracks that you're going to be putting the cards into, and twist it slightly to create a gap. In my case, there is a section in which I need to place other little bits of card. You may or may not have to do this for your mod. At this point you may want to put a strong elastic band around the top layer of the puzzle just to make sure that all the pieces are tightly clamped together to make sure that the puzzle does not have gaps when you're putting in the epoxy sculpt. Now mix up an appropriate amount of epoxy sculpt for whatever you're trying to extend. You will want to do this all at once to keep things consistent, so definitely make sure you have a couple hours, depending on the size of the puzzle, to work on this. Now simply put a little bit of epoxy sculpt into each one of the holes and push it down with a pencil. You want to push it down a little bit just to make sure that the epoxy sculpt gets all the way down to the bottom. This could cause problems later, but it'll be very easy to fix them if that does happen, so don't worry about it too much. You want to make sure that throughout this process, the cards are still perfectly vertical and all the cards are still nice and straight. If you find that you have rectangles or slightly off cards, simply push into the holes with the pencil to move around the card slightly until you can get it to be perfectly square. You will now want to let your epoxy sculpt dry for at least 12 hours once you're happy with the result. Now that the epoxy sculpt is cured, take the face of the puzzle and dip it into some water. Let it soak for about 15 minutes. After it is soaked for at least 15 minutes, take the puzzle out, make sure not too much water gets into the inside, so maybe dry off the face a little bit. And you may notice now at this point that none of the layers actually turn. Just take your box cutter and run gently along each one of the cuts to free up any of the layers. Then start turning the puzzle slowly and you'll notice that the cards start to scrape away and create little chunks that fall out. Keep putting it into the water and keep turning it until there's no longer chunks falling. At this point your extensions are pretty much finished. All you need to do now is sand the extensions with some very fine grit sandpaper to get rid of the remaining card. You may have to go over some sections in which little air pockets remained and fill those with epoxy sculpt, but overall